That night felt different, as if time was passing slower than usual. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to ignore the strange feeling that had been bothering me. Ever since my aunt came to stay, something had changed. Not just in this house, but also in me. The way she smiled, the warm look in her eyes, but it held something I couldn't quite decipher. Even her habit of always choosing to sleep in my room whenever she came over. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, or maybe because she felt more comfortable. But night after night passed, and that habit never changed. In fact, something strange felt increasingly stuck in the silence of the night. And without me realizing it, that curiosity slowly turned into an anxiety I could no longer ignore. My name is Tony. I live alone in the house I've lived in since my parents moved out of town for Cerita. This house isn't actually that big, but it's enough to make me feel comfortable. At least before all this happened, my days were monotonous. Waking up, going to work, coming home, then spending time alone. Nothing really changed. Until one afternoon, Aunt Mira arrived carrying a small suitcase and a warm smile that always managed to lighten the mood. Aunt Mira is my mother's younger sister. I've been quite close to her since childhood. She's the type of person who is always attentive, laughs easily, and has a unique way of making people feel cared for. So when she said she wanted to stay a few days at my house, I didn't mind at all. In fact, her presence made the usually quiet house feel more lively. The first night went normally. We had dinner together, talked about light things, and even laughed for a long time because of the old stories she brought up. It felt like returning to childhood, when everything felt simple and carefree. But there was one small thing that started to feel different. When it was time for bed, Aunt Mira came into my room carrying a pillow. "I'll sleep here, Ton. The guest room feels cold and mold," she said casually. I was silent for a moment, but didn't think anything of it. Maybe it was just a matter of comfort. I just nodded, trying to brush it off as normal. After all, we were still family. But the next night, the same thing happened again. And the night after that, At first, I tried to ignore it, but as time went on, I began to feel something was off. It wasn't because of her presence in my room, but because of her gradually changing demeanor. Sometimes she'd seem to stay silent longer than usual, staring blankly out the window, as if her mind were elsewhere. Her smile was still there, but it felt different, like it was forced. I began to notice that every night Aunt Mira seemed reluctant to be alone. She always made sure to stay close to me, even for the smallest things. One night I woke up and found her still awake, sitting against the headboard, hugging her knees in silence. "What's wrong, Auntie?" I asked quietly. She just turned her head, smiled faintly, and said, "It's okay, Ton. I just can't sleep." It sounded simple, but somehow it didn't feel honest. From then on, my mind began to fill with questions. Why did she always choose to sleep in my room? Why did she seem restless every night? And what bothered me most? Why did I feel like she was hiding something from me? The house that once felt peaceful was slowly changing. Not because of her presence, but because of the atmosphere that came with it. An atmosphere that was hard to explain, but strong enough to keep me thinking about it every night. And without me realizing it, my curiosity began to grow. Slowly, but surely. That night, that curiosity finally turned into something bigger. A worry I could no longer ignore. I woke up in the middle of the night to a faint sound, like a muffled whisper. At first, I thought it was just a dream. But when I opened my eyes, the atmosphere in the room felt different. The night light was still dimly lit, and Aunt Mira was not at her bedside. My heart immediately beat faster. I got up slowly, trying not to make a sound. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, as if it had been left that way on purpose. Through the gap, I saw Aunt Mira's shadow standing in the living room. She hugged herself, pacing back and forth anxiously, like someone being chased by something unseen. "Tante," I called softly. She was startled. Her body immediately stiffened, then turned around with a pale face I had never seen before. Her eyes widened, her breath hitched. "You're awake, Tan?" Her voice trembled. I approached, trying to calm her down. But before I could ask what happened, her phone suddenly lit up in her hand. A message had come in. The screen reflected a cold light onto her face, and I could clearly see the look of fear she could no longer hide. The message had no sender's name, just a string of numbers and a short sentence. "I know where you are." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Auntie, who is this?" I asked quietly but firmly. She immediately turned off her phone, clutching it tightly as if it could protect her. "It doesn't matter, Tan. Just a prankster." Her answer was quick, too quick. But I knew it wasn't the real answer. Since that night, everything had changed. Auntie Mira had become increasingly restless. She would often check the door many times before bed, making sure it was locked. I even saw her peeking out the window several times, as if making sure no one was outside. And what made me most uneasy was she was increasingly reluctant to be away from me. I began to feel like this wasn't just a strange habit anymore. It was something real, something potentially dangerous. It culminated 2 nights later, when we had just turned off the lights and were trying to sleep, when we suddenly heard footsteps outside the house. Slow, but distinct, followed by this sound of someone touching the vents and stopping right in front of the door. Aunt Mira and I stared at each other in the darkness. She grabbed my arm tightly. Her fingers were cold and trembling. "Don't come out, Tan." Her whisper was barely audible. But the voice came again. This time closer, more real. And for the first time, I realized whoever sent the message might have found us. The room suddenly felt suffocating. I could hear my own ragged breathing mixed with Aunt Mira's tightening grip on my arm. Her face was pale, her eyes staring at the door as if the thing she feared most was actually standing behind it. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Too silence. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just someone passing by. Maybe I was too caught up in the moment. But before my thoughts could finish, there was another louder sound, like someone gently knocking on my iron gate 3 times. Two. Knock, knock, knock. Aunt Mira covered her mouth, holding back, the sound of her breathing becoming labored. "Tan, don't look outside," she whispered softly, almost pleading. But it was precisely that sentence that made me even more certain that this was far more serious than I had thought. I couldn't stay silent and let this house turn into a place of fear. Carefully, I released her grip and stood up. Aunt Mira immediately tugged at the hem of my shirt. "No, Tony. Please. Not now." I looked at her. For the first time, I saw tears welling in her eyes. "I have to know what she heard happened, Auntie," I said quietly but firmly. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. She fell silent. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. I walked slowly to the window, peeking through the curtains. The front yard was empty. The porch light illuminated the fence and the rain-slicked street, but there was no one there. Empty. But that made me even more uneasy. If there was no one, then who was knocking on the fence? I opened the bedroom door and walked into the living room. Each step felt heavy. The house that usually felt familiar suddenly felt strange that night. I checked the front door was locked. Everything was secure until my eyes caught something under the door. A white envelope. My heart stopped for a moment. I bent down and picked it up. There was no name, no address, just a plain, slightly damp note. From behind me, I heard Aunt Mila's hurried footsteps approaching. As soon as she saw the envelope in my hand, her face immediately lost color. "Don't open it," she said, almost shouting. But it was too late. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was only a small piece of paper with rough, hurried handwriting. "You can't run forever, ever." I swallowed. The room suddenly felt cold. "Auntie," my voice trailed off. Who was this person? This time Aunt Mira no longer shied away. Her shoulders dropped slowly, as if all her strength was gone. She sat on the sofa and covered her face with both hands. "I actually hoped you didn't need to know all this," she said quietly. I sat in front of her, waiting. A few seconds passed before she finally looked up. Her gaze was blank, but full of a burden she had kept to herself for so long. "A few months ago," he started telling me, "I'm in trouble with someone from my past, someone obsessive, and won't accept it. When it's over, and my chest felt tight when I heard it. At first, it was just messages, then calls. I changed numbers, even quit my job temporarily. But he always found a way." He looked at me with teary eyes. "That's why I always sleep in your room, Ton. Not because the guest room is cold, but because I'm afraid to be alone." I fell silent. All the strange pieces of what had happened so far finally started to make sense. But at the same time, I realized something even more frightening. If that person already knew Aunt Mira was in my house, then I too had been dragged into this problem. And that night, while I was still trying to process everything, my own phone suddenly vibrated. An unknown number. With trembling hands, I opened the message. There was only one sentence. "Now you're involved too." The sentence seemed to hit my mind mercilessly. My hands went cold. My breath hitched. I stared at the screen for a few seconds longer, hoping the writing would heal or just disappear. But no, the words remained there. Cold, firm, and full of threats. "Tony," Aunt Mira's voice called softly. I looked up, and without saying anything, showed her the contents of the message. Instantly, her expression collapsed. She took a step back and sat limply on the sofa. It was as if all the fear she had been holding back had finally become real. I don't want you to go to Nathan." Her voice broke. I held the phone tightly. In my head, there was only one thought. This has gone too far. It's not just about curiosity anymore. About safety. "I won't stay silent, Auntie," I said firmly. Even though my heart was filled with doubt, we have to finish this. Yes. Before Auntie Mira could answer, suddenly there was a bang. A loud sound hit the front door. We both jumped. The sound came again, stronger, more brutal. It was as if someone out there was losing patience. "Tony, don't open it!" Auntie Mira immediately stood up and pulled my arm. But this time I didn't back down. If I kept hiding, this would never end. That person already knew I was here. Maybe he had been watching for a long time. Bang, bang! The door was knocked again. "I know you're inside." A man's voice came from outside. Heavy, oppressive, and sent shivers down my spine. I swallowed hard. This was the source of all my fear. Finally, I stood right in front of my house. I looked at Aunt Mira. She shook her head quickly. Tears fell uncontrollably. "Please, Ton, don't." But I had made my decision. With slow steps, I approached the door. Every second felt like walking towards something uncertain. My hand touched the cold doorknob. I paused for a moment. This was the point where everything could change. I could stay silent, hide, and hope this would all pass. Or I could open the door and face reality no matter the risk. The hardest, and perhaps the most dangerous choice. I took a deep breath. Then, the door clicked open. Before me stood a man with a sharp gaze and a faint smile that made the atmosphere even more tense. His eyes were directly fixed on me, as if he had been waiting for me for a long time. "So it's you, huh?" he said quietly. I stood still, trying to hold back the fear that was starting to take over. "Where's Aunt Mira?" he continued. I didn't answer, but from behind, I could feel Aunt Mira standing on the floor. The man took a step closer. He thought he could escape me. His voice turned colder. I told him he would never let go. My chest felt tight, but I remained standing in front of the door, blocking his way in. "Your problem is with Aunt Mira, not me," I said, trying to sound brave. He gave me a sideways glance. "It's all my business now?" he answered quietly. And that's when I realized all my attempts to avoid this had failed. There was no turning back. All that was left was one last option. To face it all. Whatever happened, I took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling that spread from my toes to my chest. The man in front of me was staring intently, as if waiting for the slightest opening for me to step in. But this time I wouldn't give him any space. "Enough of this," I said firmly, even though my heart was beating erratically. "If you have a problem, solve it the right way. Don't be terrorized like this." He laughed softly, a cold, emotionless laugh. "Do you think this is about right or wrong?" he replied sarcastically. "This is about her being mine." And he ran. Those words made me angry, but I knew fighting back would only make things worse, Maddie's worse. I had to stay calm and smart. Behind my back, I could feel Aunt Mira standing there, her breath held. This wasn't just about my courage now, but also about giving him the sense of security he'd been searching for. I stepped him forward slightly, still blocking the door. "He doesn't belong to anyone," I said quietly but firmly. "And if you keep this up, I won't hesitate to call the police." For a moment, the man fell silent. His gaze changed from anger to calculation. It was as if he realized the situation was no longer completely in his control. "Police?" He grinned. "Go ahead." But this time I wasn't just talking. With still shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and actually dialed the emergency number. The screen lit up brightly between us. The atmosphere suddenly changed. The silence felt heavier than before. A few seconds passed, and for the first time, the man took a step back. "Are you serious?" His voice was muffled. I didn't answer. My gaze remained unwavering. The voice on the other end of the line began to ring, asking about the situation. I explained it briefly, clearly, and without any concealment. The man took a deep breath and looked at me, with an expression that was hard to decipher between annoyance and resignation. "This isn't over," he said quietly, before finally turning around. He took a step back until he disappeared into the darkness of the night. I immediately closed and locked the door tightly. The house was silent again, but this time it wasn't a tense silence, more like a relief that slowly filled the space. I looked back. Aunt Mira was standing there. Her tears fell silently. But this time it wasn't from fear, but from a burden that was finally starting to lift. Thank you, Ton, she whispered softly. I nodded slowly. A few moments later, this sound of sirens could be heard approaching, breaking the silence of the night. For the first time since all this began, I felt like we were no longer alone. And maybe this was the beginning of the end of all that fear. The sound of sirens that night felt like a boundary between the terror-filled past and the new hope that was slowly starting to emerge. The lights of police vehicles illuminated my yard, breaking the darkness that had felt so oppressive for the past few days. I stood in the doorway with Aunt Mira. For the first time, she wasn't hiding behind me. Although her face still held a trace of fear, there was something different in her eyes. A small courage that had finally emerged after being suppressed for so long. The officer came to listen to our explanation seriously. All the evidence, the mysterious message, the threatening envelope, and the events of that night were the beginning of a process that Aunt Mira had always avoided. She held my hand tightly as she gave her statement. But this time it wasn't out of fear, but because she knew she wasn't alone anymore. The days that followed weren't immediately easy. There was a long process to go through. Examinations, follow-up reports, and the occasional uninvited anxiety. But slowly, things began to change. Aunt Mira began to return to her old self. She smiled sincerely again, laughed carefreely, and no longer woke up in the middle of the night looking panicked. One night, she even said something simple but meaningful. I want to try sleeping in the guest room tonight, Ton. I paused for a moment, then smiled. Not because she was finally no longer sleeping in my room, but because I knew it was a sign that she was starting to make peace with her fear. That night, the house felt different, no longer filled with anxiety, but a calming silence. I sat in the living room, remembering everything that had happened, from simple curiosity to the harsh reality that forced us to face something we had been avoiding. I finally understood one thing. Sometimes people don't look for a comfortable place, but a place where they feel safe. And often they don't say anything. They just hope that someone cares enough to notice. Aunt Mira never really wanted to make me suspicious. She was just trying to survive in her own way. And I unknowingly became her place of refuge. Now it's all over. The wound may not completely disappear, but at least it no longer controls our lives. Because in the end, courage is not about fighting without fear, but standing still even though fear is still there. And that night, for the first time in a long time, we could truly sleep peacefully.